Hello, I'm Mark McCrindle, and here at McCrindle Research, we were delighted to conduct research for the UK National Ministry Survey. Now, there's a full 48-page report that you can freely access at nationalministrysurvey.org, and I'd encourage you to get hold of that. But right now, let me give you a summary of the key findings. 3 phases of research comprised this study. We conducted an online survey of 584 church leaders, Protestant churches in the UK. This built on research by Savanta, a survey of more than 3,000 active Protestant adults in the UK, defined as those who attend church at least once a month, and also a survey of 3,000 adults of the general public. So this excluded active Protestants. Now notice the 3 icons here that you'll see in the report and in this summary right now. The church leaders in orange, the active Protestants in purple, and that icon for the general public in blue. So when active Protestants were asked when they came to faith, you can see that for 3 in 4 of them, it was before the age of 18. So in the childhood and teenage years is when the majority of Protestants come to faith. When they were asked what were the key factors in them coming to faith, you can see that attending a church service in person was number 1. The influence and encouragement of parents and family members, number 2. Reading the Bible on their own, number 3. And 4th, seeing a Christian's lifestyle, authenticity lived out right there. Of those who are brought up Protestant but no longer identify as Christian, well, what age did they stop identifying as Christians? And you can see it's also in the younger years, 55% before the age of 18. So young people are coming to faith, but it's also in those young age groups that people are dropping from the Protestant faith based on this research. Now, also from the general public, why did those who once identified as Christians and no longer are, why are they no longer? And you can see number 1, they found that science better answered their questions. Number 2, they disagreed with church teaching. Number 3 was church scandals and hypocrisy. And number 4 on the list, personal experience of suffering or being around those close ones who went through suffering. But when the general public were asked about their openness to having faith conversations, you can see that openness is the key feature here. Now, depending on who we're talking about, that openness drops. But with family, the majority of people in the UK are open to talk about religion and indeed Jesus. Friends, still a fair bit of openness. Those workmates or colleagues are still quite open. Acquaintances, neighbours, even strangers, a quarter will talk about the issues of religion or indeed Jesus. They're open to having these faith and spiritual conversations. In fact, while there is openness there, the interesting statistic here is that 71% of the general public cannot remember having a conversation with a Christian about their faith in the last 10 years. So they're saying that they're open, but they're just not exposed to those conversations. Now note, and we write this up in the research, that 73% of the general public don't approve of attempts by religious people to convert others to their faith. So there is some caution around this proselytizing, yet an openness to having these faith discussions. So how comfortable or uncomfortable, again, are the general public in attending the following, a church service around Christmas or Easter? And you can see the majority there, very comfortable or comfortable. So a significant openness to attending church services at these key times of year. Even when we look at a regular church service or a small group where the Bible is studied, a course explaining Christianity or meeting up with a Christian to read the Bible together, there is still a fairly good proportion of the general public that say they are very comfortable or comfortable with that. You can see that the proportion that move into feeling uncomfortable does rise as we move down this list, but nonetheless, there is a fair bit of comfort, even around some of these smaller gatherings. Now, we then asked those who said that they were to some extent comfortable, we said, well, let's bring up the online, and how does that affect things? How much more or less likely are these people of the general public who express some level of comfort to attend these events if they're online. And when it comes to a Christmas service, an Easter service, even a general church service, online, in person, some are more likely, some are less likely. So there's not much gain. But particularly when we move to small groups and courses explaining Christianity and meeting up with someone, you've got a greater comfort, an increased likelihood of attendance when we move to the online. So online certainly for these activities has its place. And church leaders are setting the example when it comes to talking about their faith with a non-Christian, at least weekly beyond their formal ministry role. They're leading their churches by example. The encouraging thing is the churchgoers are following their example. Active Protestants, when asked when was the last time they talked about their relationship with Jesus Christ with someone who is not a Christian, and you can see more than half say that it was in the last month at least. So we've got good activity of active Protestants in sharing their faith as well. And there's this perception that these conversations about Jesus have an impact. More than 3 in 5 churchgoers believe their conversation with a non-Christian has had a positive impact on the other person's opinion or belief about Jesus. And the general public, when they've been exposed to these conversations, a similar proportion said that it did. It was a pleasant conversation. It did have some positive perception outcomes. But there are some slight disparities between the perspective of church leaders and the churchgoers, as this highlights. 66% of Christians, active Protestants, are comfortable talking to a non-Christian about Jesus, but the same proportion, 66% of church leaders, believe church members feel afraid to evangelize as they risk rejection. These next two are interesting as well. Almost 2/3 of Christians believe it's every Christian's responsibility to talk to non-Christians about Jesus, but just over half of the church leaders are concerned people are relying on church events to invite others rather than evangelizing in their daily life. It seems from the analysis of this data that the church leaders have more concerns than is perhaps the perspective and the activity of those churchgoers. So why churchgoers feel comfortable? Now, this is those that say they feel confident or very confident in talking about their faith with a non-Christian. Why is that the case? Well, they feel at ease. They don't feel under pressure is the biggest response. They are interested in discussing faith and sharing with others. The third factor there, they feel knowledgeable enough. They have their strong beliefs and want to share those, and that they want these people to know Jesus. What about those who feel to some extent uncomfortable sharing their faith? What are the blockers to them sharing? They feel others wouldn't be interested in what they have to say. They're not confident that their beliefs would be listened to. Third on the list, that they believe they'll be mocked and lose respect. They fear spoiling a relationship, and it makes them feel under pressure. So being aware of the factors that drive the discussions and the blockers to sharing and outreach is important for church leaders to understand. If we move to the church leaders in the research, great news on vibrancy around churches and church planting. 21% of church leaders are extremely very likely to plant a church in the next 5 years. By the way, another 41% say that they're to some extent likely. So certainly those that are highly likely, 1 in 5, that's pretty positive. And 13% of church leaders are extremely very likely to revitalize a church in the next 5 years. Another 50% say to some extent likely. And when we look at the high likelihood of planting churches and revitalizing churches, you can see we're seeing that even more in the urban areas. 27% of church leaders say they're extremely very likely to plant a church, compared to 14% in some of the smaller locales, and revitalizing 16% compared to 9% in the less urban areas. So vibrancy, activity, and a real focus on church planting, particularly in those urban locations. Church leaders here share the top 3 perceived barriers to starting a church plant. Number 1, not having the right person to lead the church plant, being too small or fragile to be able to lose a significant number of people in this church plant process, or not having a launch team of 20 plus people. These were the blockers to them starting those church plants. Money was not the big issue. Interesting to see. That was down lower on the list. And the top areas that church leaders are looking for training in. Now, it wasn't in theological areas and preaching. They felt largely, almost 9 in 10, felt adequate training there. But it was in areas like cultural inclusion and reaching the cultural context, 46%, understanding the people, the population, the changing demographics and dynamics, 43%, the next generation leadership development and building a ministry training culture, 43%, church revitalization. So when we ask church leaders about mentoring, firstly, 31% are receiving mentoring, more than 2/3 though aren't. But of those that are receiving mentoring, almost all of them, 93%, are finding it useful. Of those 2/3 that aren't receiving mentoring, half are open to it, are interested in it. So it's just that we haven't got that resource, that opportunity their way, it seems. And church leaders are looking for consultancy. We've got 23% have received constructive assessment of their ministry. 3/4, as you can see, haven't. Of those who have, 4 and 5 say it was helpful. And of those who haven't received it, half say they would like to receive a constructive assessment of their ministry. So the impacts of COVID have been mixed. For some churches, they've grown. For a third, they've decreased. A third stayed the same. So it's been very varied in its impacts. But what are the causes of discouragement amongst church leaders at the moment? It has been a tough season with COVID. As we saw, it's had some impacts, varied impacts, but it's division in the church. That's the biggest cause of discouragement. And disagreement between church leaders is part of that as well. Slow growth for 28% is one of those as well. We can be encouraged that church leaders are trying new things. They're engaging in new ways. They're trying to understand the changing context where they are planted. And this data as well. How often do you try new things at your church? And you can see there the majority, more than half, say more than once a year, another quarter once a year. Well, what are the opportunities for the church? We unpack these recommendations in a bit more detail in the report, but let's make the most of conversation opportunities in a time where there is openness for these spiritual discussions. Let's make the most of this openness to attend church. Make the most of those online opportunities, because in some of those areas, that's where the openness is greater. Let's train and embolden the church for evangelism, and let's support leaders in evangelism, culture, planting and revitalizing. And the final one here, support leaders through mentoring and consultancy. That's what they're looking for. Only the minority have taken advantage of that. Good opportunities for the church to grow in those areas. And if our leaders are well equipped, they'll lead the churches through these times of unprecedented change. I commend the report to you, nationalministrysurvey.org. I trust it'll be of help, and may God bless the church in the UK.